part of this, which is the film that's
Sorry.
I think you did fly over as well.
Hey Tom. This is Ryan. Tom's my Hi. Nice to meet you. I'm Ryan. What do you do?
Yes. What? In fact, I did have 12 students, so those
You guys should see.
How's our front line?
I actually gave it up to
Okay. Because I checked it said like right setting that just want to sit down here for the camera.
Are you watching in German?
Maybe I am.
I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm going to sit down and let you.
Good.
Hello.
This works. Everything is ready. It's loaded on the back.
Hello. Hello. I used to be so careless that I could read anything, but now I don't have my glasses on. And you sound like I know, let's say that. I know. I don't look like a Floridian. People from Florida are known as Floridians.
Nice to meet you.
We met before. Someone else. Yeah.
I think he would.
I was 17 years. I was in Canada for 40 years. Although I got an English accent.
I was in his direction. Literally last month. I'm trying to figure out
How long to that? Oh, I see.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Centre for the Critical Study of Apocalyptic and Millenarian Movements. It's a wonderful pleasure to see everybody here this morning. Just a few points to start with. Toilet is over there, easily marked, and then there's another one in the museum if that one's occupied, sort of as you where you came into the campus. It's been a while to get to this point, and it's a wonderful pleasure for me personally. We're surrounded by all of these crafts that have been made by the kids in Bedford over the last couple of weeks. They've been using recycled materials. These are what they call their trees of hope. So let's hope that we give them something to be hopeful about today. I'm going to introduce the chair of the Panacea Trust and the person whose brainchild this is, which is Justin Meggitt, who is a lecturer at Cambridge University. Justin.
Simon, is this? Oh, yes. I'd just say a few words because I think we'd like to get on with the conference itself, but I thought I should say a few things about the Trust and the Centre for the Critical Study of Apocalyptic and Millenarian Movements. So the Panacea Charitable Trust is the continuation, in a sense, of a religious movement which died out a few years ago, and we no longer are, as it were, a religious movement. The trustees are not involved with that movement, as all the members are no longer with us. But we've tried to make sense of the sort of legacy of the group in various ways for the contemporary world. So we have, as I hope you'll get a chance to see, those of you who haven't seen it, we have a museum here which explains something, interprets the tradition of that particular religious group and associated movements. We also have archives associated with that group. But also this centre was something that we thought was important to set up, because we wanted to have some way in which people could think critically about apocalyptic and millenarian ideas and their cultural and political and religious whatever impacts. So we're having a series of conferences on themes related to this. The first, quite recently, was on violence and millenarian movements, and we have one coming up on the Reformation, and we hope to have at least 2 or 3 a year of similar sorts of things that will be recorded and available, so that not just the people in the room, but also worldwide, people will be able to access some of the best thinking on this subject. So that was the idea, to create an environment in which people could do that. And it was very important for us for that to be multidisciplinary, for it to bring together people from different disciplines. And I hope those here today will find that stimulating. As somebody who works in religious studies, I do find it remarkably useful to have such a wide range of different perspectives on topics which to me have been long familiar, but I can see them through, as it were, fresh eyes. So I hope we'll find that this weekend. Anyway, you don't really want to hear me talking anymore. You really want to get on with the papers, but I really would like to just emphasize that I'm very pleased to see people here today, and I'd like to welcome both the speakers, those people who've never been to Bedford, but also people from the local community too, because it's extremely important that what we do is of benefit not just to a small group of academics, important though they are, but it's accessible and of interest to the wider world. So thank you very much indeed. And now David Livingstone, I think, is due to speak on Our Past and Our Future. Is the weather to blame? Thank you very much.
Okay, we're on. Well, I'd like to thank the organisers of this meeting, first of all, for the invitation to give this keynote speech. It comes from a larger piece of work that I'm trying to do, which is to write about the history of how climate has been seen to be the explanation for, well, frankly, most everything. And I'm a little bit skeptical about its omnipotent powers, which is not, of course, for a minute to deny the huge significance that climate change is having in our own world right now. So when I was talking with Simon about this, what I thought I would do is do something that is both contemporary but also historical, that we can understand something of the role that climate has been thought to play in human history, and also the role that people think climate will play in our future history, if I can put it that way. So our past and our future is the weather to blame. In a recent piece for the New York-based organisation Global Citizen, the columnist Joe McCarthy posed the question, is climate change really a national security threat? Framed this way, he began, the question contains a sense of Hollywood inevitability. Climate change brings drought to a region. Different factions struggle for precious water resources and end up clashing. These plots, McCarthy says, might be suitable for a big budget script, but do they bear any resemblance to reality? And he concluded, military experts seem to think so. I think he might well have added, so would Thomas Malthus. So here's my first theme, apocalypse now, or at least pretty soon. The sense of eschatological inevitability in some climate scenarios seems to me to be palpable, and it's commonly heard. Some of you in the room may remember Chris Huhne, then Britain's Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, as he put it in 2011, to the Future Maritime Operations Conference in a speech entitled The Geopolitics of Climate Change. He said this: "Climate change will lead to an increased threat of war, violence, and military action against the UK, and risks reversing the progress of civilization." Now, it's this impulse towards militarizing climate that is of interest to me today. Even in the current White House, as part of an administration widely known to be skeptical of the claims of climate change scientists, Defense Secretary General James Mad Dog Mattis observed during his confirmation hearings, "The effects of a changing climate impact our security situation. I will ensure that the department continues to be prepared to conduct operations today and in the future, and that we are prepared to address the effects of a changing climate on our threat assessments, resources, and readiness." Interesting to think that the only place that climate change thinking might occupy in the White House is in connection with the military. It may tell us something. By now, this is a well-known refrain. A decade ago, in 2007, the Center for Strategic and International Studies produced a Pentagon-orientated report entitled The Age of Consequences. Here, laying out the security implications of climate change scenarios for American foreign policy, the document announced a range of consequences in robustly apocalyptic language. A sampling will suffice. Among the severe outcomes of a 2.6 degrees Celsius rise in temperature will be what they describe as moral revolution. Massive social upheaval will be accompanied by intense religious and ideological turmoil, the report declared. Among traditional religious beliefs, the losers are likely to be those faiths that have formed the closest association with the secular world and with scientific rationalism. This intensified search for spiritual meaning will be all the more poignant under conditions of severe climate change. At 5.6 degrees increase, a range of ills are covered, and they will converge in one conflagration. Rage at government's inability to deal with the abrupt and unpredictable crises, religious fervour, perhaps even a dramatic rise in millennial end-of-day cults, hostility and violence towards migrants and minority groups, and intra- and interstate conflict over resources. So the resurgence of apocalyptic thought is itself conditioned by what is believed to be climate change. Now, in the light of these apocalyptic divinations, the overall conclusion insisted that it was the security repercussions of climate change that were most important. They were, quotes, "a greater foreign policy and national security challenge than reversing the decline in America's global standing or rebuilding the nation's armed forces." Now, I think what's added further urgency to this sense of climatic catalysm are reports from medical organizations stressing the dire health effects of climate change. Curb global warming or face a health catastrophe, the Times newspaper told its readers in June 2015. Climate change, the article began, is creating a medical emergency. Severe drought, it predicted, could well result in 1.5 billion more medical incidents every year. With extreme heat and excessive rainfall, the number could soar to 2 to 3 million, I'm still quoting. Detailing the results of research carried out by an interdisciplinary team of European and Chinese collaborators for the 2015 Lancet magazine, entitled Commission on Health and Climate Change, the newspaper quoted its author's conclusion. Climate change could have potentially catastrophic effects for human health. In comparable vein, the US Natural Resources Defense Council expects the health-related costs of extreme weather incidents to increase, and I quote, by billions more dollars. Small wonder, the report notes, that some people have likened the effects of climate change to weather on steroids. Now, the militarizing and medicalizing of weather are all of a piece with the surge in popular books depicting how climate will indeed write our future. Take, for example, this work, just one of many, Climate Wars, by Gwyn Dyer, published in 2008. To give a sense of urgency to this prophetic Jeremiah, Dyer settled on a number of future scenarios, telling us what it would be like in Russia 2019, North India 2036, China in 2042, and the like. He did this to depict, and this is his word, the apocalyptic impact climate change will have on human civilization. The message is pretty grim. For every degree that the average global temperature rises, so do the number of failed and failing states, and very probably the incidence of internal and international war. Along the way to a projected increase of 2.8 degrees Celsius by 2042, Dyer painted a picture of a collapsed European Union, its northern members struggling to close borders to refugees from the famine-stricken Mediterranean countries. A dominant Russia, he says, will now be the undisputed great power of Asia. And of course, an ever more fragile frontier between the United States and Mexico will be put under intolerable strain. No surprise that the United States military, Dyer concludes, already sees its next major mission as the long struggle to maintain stability as climate change continually undermines it. Now, this inclination to what I'm going to call thermal eschatology is now widespread. Take the National Geographic Channel's 2008 television show, 6 Degrees Could Change the World. Under the strapline, 6 Degrees charts climatic apocalypse in HD television, a columnist with the Denver Post had this to say, likening the program to, wait for it, she likened it to a cool disaster movie, complete with fantastic animation and scary predictions. A meteorological apocalypse, as she put it, was underway. Let's hear what she has to say. At 2 degrees warmer, Category 6 hurricanes become regular occurrences. At 4 degrees, hordes of climate refugees flee famine, with the number increasing into the tens of millions when it gets to 5. Now, accompanying this broadcast was an interactive website inviting visitors to explore the world's future at different degrees of global warming. Thermal eschatology. Enter the site, and a map of the world appears with what I call a disaster dial along the margin. That appears on the screen. In line with the program, viewers are confronted with exactly these dire warnings. You turn the dial to 2 degrees warmer, and what do you find on the map? Urban Bolivians moving into rural areas in search of water. Click on 2 more degrees, and deserts arrive in southern Europe. Click another one at 5, that brings worldwide political upheaval, economic disaster, and armed conflict as heat-weary migrants seek climate refuge in places like Northern Europe and New Zealand. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are arriving. Now, in all these scenarios, the tragic history of your future and mine reduces to the vicissitudes of climate's reign. Here, climate is writing a script that stars Malthus and Hobbes as the leading dramatis personae. Exceed the world's climatically determined carrying capacity, and countless millions will live a life that's nasty, brutish, and very short. The general direction of the tracks along which climate is propelling Homo sapiens is very clear. Apocalypse now, or if not, at least pretty soon. Now, of course, it's not just historians of the future who practice history by degree. The archaeologist Brian Fagan tells his readers an average rise of even a degree or 2 can dash a civilization. The subtitles of a sequence of his popular archaeological works advertise the priority he accords to climate in shaping the human past, of course, as well as the human future. Some of the titles: El Niño and the Fate of Civilizations. How climate made history. How climate changed civilization. Now, while Fagin claims to disavow crude determinism, he is nonetheless sure that climate changes have channeled the entire direction in which human history has flowed. So we're told things like this, that the Norse conquests, cathedrals, these are a consequence of a global climatic phenomenon, an enduring legacy of the medieval warm period. And we're told that the Great Warming propelled humanity across the Bering Strait. At the same time, drawing on the work of Wolfgang Behringer, he attributes the dramatic rise in, wait for it, accusations of witchcraft during the 1560s to changing weather patterns during Europe's Little Ice Age. Now, Fagin is not a lone voice. Numerous authors find and have found in climate and climate change history's first cause, history's primum mobile. Take Jared Diamond, for example. In his prize-winning panorama of global history, Guns, Germs and Steel, he set out to demonstrate how geography had shaped the destiny of Europeans, Asians, Africans, Native Americans and Aboriginal Australians. Now, to be frank, the book is a virtuoso performance. Yet the architecture of the argument is fairly straightforward. Lurking behind the guns, germs and steel that have steered global history, rendering some societies disproportionately powerful and innovative, lies a far more fundamental cause. That cause is food production. In Diamond's vision, everything from the evolution of germs and technological innovation to the development of writing and complex political organization is connected by chains of causation to food provision. It runs something like this. Food production required sedentary living and hence the accumulation of possessions. In turn, this facilitated more specialized forms of social organization and the emergence of groups not directly engaged in the food-generating process who could devote themselves to economic management, craft work, political organization and the like. Global history, to him, it seems, is the story of two things, food and fate. Across the face of the earth, Diamond argues, it was the means of food production, and I quote him, that determined which peoples become history's have-nots and which became history's haves, where advanced civilizations would develop. It determined which languages would triumph in the worldwide clash of cultures. Behind all this, of course, lie elemental environmental realities. Again and again, behind Diamond's comparative geography of domestic plant and animal cultivation lies one thing, the iron will of climate. As he puts it in a generalizing principle, couched in the language of Darwinian adaptationism, which I'm sure you like, Michael, the germination, growth, and disease resistance of plants are adapted to climate. Fine. Each plant population becomes genetically programmed through natural selection to respond appropriately to signals of the seasonal regime under which it has evolved. But in the polity of plants, climate reigns supreme. Consequently, it rules no less imperiously in the story of human affairs. Now, something similar comes through in David Landis's monumental work, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations. Now, in this work, he rails against the champions of multiculturalism, against those interested in egalitarian history. He says these are people who just ignore the real predominance of the West and write as though history had never happened. To Landis, the fact of the matter is simple. I quote him, Western technological precedence just is there. A brute fact. And tellingly, he resorts to the early 20th century writings of Ellsworth Huntington, to whom we'll presently return, to account for why the rich nations and rich countries lie in the temperate zones, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. The poor countries lie in the tropics and semi-tropics. And so to explain this geography of economic failure, his first port of call is, of course, climate. To elucidate what he calls, and let me use his words, the simple, direct effects of the environment. Those effects are both physiological and cultural. Everything from the production of perspiration in what he calls the sweaty climates, to the siesta, a cultural adaptation designed to keep people inactive in the heat of the day. Better keep the temperature down here today, Simon, or we'll be out for the count. Historically, such tropical and semi-tropical zones just inevitably induced slavery. But more, hot climates also encourage the proliferation of life forms hostile to man, his words, which breed rapidly and encourage the dissemination of disease. Cold weather's better. Winter, he insists, and I quote, is the great friend of humanity. It wipes out insects and parasites. This is what I would call a kind of snow morality that prevails for him. And so the globe is divided, if not exactly into the pestilential and the paradisial, certainly into something pretty close. The consequences are far-reaching in Land's opinion. As he sums it up in Hobbesian tomes, life in poor climates is precarious, depressed, and brutish. Not surprisingly, the adjectives that he appends to European climates stand in marked contrast. They're not precarious, depressed, or brutish. These climates are different. The temperatures are, quotes, kind. The climate is, quotes, privileged. The rain is, quotes, gentle. Now, among those resorting to climate as the primary agent of historical change, what I find in these analyses, to get to my own viewpoint here, is the popularity of what I'm going to call inferential storylines. This is what I call the might-have, must-have school of historical explanation. This device serves to build plausible scenarios, gripping narratives, and compelling plot lines. Let's go back to Brian Fagan, with whom I began. He writes that early Europeans experiencing the Great Warming during 15,000 to 11,000 BC may have, if it's going to come up, please do. Why is that not coming up? May have cut back on hunting. That one solution, this is taking a while. Can I just hit this instead? Yeah, I've got them all now. Might have been to pulverize nuts to overcome the harmful effects of high protein on pregnant women. Similarly, we learn that the harsh drought and cold of the Younger Dryas may have triggered a shift to farming. That when El Nino descended with primordial fury on the Moche civilization, the ideological effect would have been to reinforce the ruler's authority. And then we get to the telling one that the new climatic conditions must have undermined the confidence of generations. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with using speculative suggestions in historical writing. But conjecture can rapidly surrender to certitude, and thus to an easy confidence in the supremely important causal powers of climate. Listen to what he says. After AD 500, prolonged droughts in the southern highlands, far from the Moche homeland, coincided with strong El Nino episodes in the north, causing widespread political adjustments. Here we move from speculation to declaration, from insinuation to affirmation. At the same time, I think what's often missing from such accounts is any sustained engagement with a fundamental distinction between the necessary and sufficient conditions for explaining a historical event. When we're told that Gothic cathedrals, illuminated manuscripts, ethereal woodwork, the material achievements of the High Middle Ages, when we're told that they all depended on abundant food surpluses, we certainly do find ourselves confronted with a necessary condition for those to develop. I mean, no food, no fine art. I mean, frankly, no food, no anything. Right? It's the same with the expansion of Norse fishing grounds, when ice-free conditions prevailed for a longer period after 1000 AD. Sure, no thawing, no trawling. Meat and melting may be necessary conditions for the activities they purport to explain, but are they sufficient to account for what he describes as a veritable orgy of cathedral building, whale fishing, the production of gold-decorated texts, and the like? I don't think so. Without fully exploring other explanatory factors, and by resting content with mere correlations between historical episodes and changed climate conditions, such narratives tend to foreshorten explanation and misconstrue preconditions as causal agents. Well, since climate and conflict seems to be the order of the day, I thought it'd be worthwhile now reflecting just a little bit on climate, conflict, and culpability. I'm going to use one particular example. Attributing success and stagnation to the vicissitudes of climate isn't a new pastime, of course. Nor indeed is the inclination to blame the climate for human warfare and for conflict. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, for example, a number of writers blamed the climate for the American Civil War. And briefly revisiting their accounts brings to the surface a critical issue with lingering resonance for our own time as we think about the discourses of climate and apocalypse. That is, the connections between climate, conflict, and culpability. The spirit of the Hippocratic tradition, mediated through Montesquieu, manifested itself in the writings of Ellen Churchill Semple in her account of the American Civil War. Semple was sure that climate not only modified human physiology, but also governed what she called the energy of different peoples, and thus their efficiency as, to use her words, their efficiency as political agents. But now, of course, that Hippocratic cosmos had been reworked into Darwinian categories. What she called the climatic control of early human settlement intensified the struggle for existence between human groups. And it delivered a kind of polarized world ruptured along a north-south divide, only too reminiscent of the Renaissance geohumoralists. The destiny of the old world's nations was written in the naturalized language of climate. This is what she had to say. Nature has fixed the mutual destiny of tropical and temperate zones. Now, it wasn't difficult to transfer that general principle that nature had determined mutual destinies of the tropical and temperate world. It wasn't difficult to transfer that across to the United States. She had this to say. The divergent development of northerners and southerners in America arose from contrasts in climate, soil, and area. It was not only the enervating heat and moisture of the southern states, but also the large extent of their fertile area which necessitated slave labour, introduced the plantation system, and resulted in the whole aristocratic organisation of society in the South. Now, this isn't a million miles from what contemporary climate apocalypticists are actually saying, if you attend carefully to the language. Now, this climatic mindset had long been installed in Semple's outlook. It was a simple equation. Politics followed pedology. Slavery wasn't a matter of morality. It was merely a matter of sun and soil. Conflict boiled down to climate. As she put it in 1903, the question of slavery in the United States was primarily a question of climate and soil. The morale of the institution was long a mooted question until New England, having discovered the economic unfitness of the slave industry, took the lead in the crusade against it. The South, by the same token of geographical conditions, upheld the institution both on economic and on moral grounds. A few years later, in 1915, in the work Civilization and Climate, the well-known Yale environmental determinist Huntington, whom I mentioned earlier, still surfacing a lot in contemporary writings, insisted that in accounting for the contrasts between the northern and southern states, climatic effects, he said, were the most potent. This is what he had to say about slavery. Slavery, he judged, failed to flourish in the north not because of any moral objection to it, for the most godly Puritans held slaves, but because the climate made it unprofitable. 30 years later, in 1945, he was still pushing in 1945 economic climatology as the fundamental reason for the South's underdevelopment. And he went further by reducing ethical sentiments to the vagaries of the weather. The suppression of slavery in the North was not due chiefly to moral conviction, he pronounced. That arose long after experience had shown that slavery didn't pay in a cool climate. So what on the surface looked like a question of high moral principle was merely a case of low economic pragmatism. It was all a matter of meteorology, just like the prediction of the rise of latter-day millennial cults that we're seeing right now. But these accounts, of course, weren't the first to deliver a climatic reading of the Civil War. John William Draper's 3-volume History of the American Civil War, which appeared in 1867, had already done so. Now, Draper, of course, was president of New York University from 1850 to 1873, a professor of chemistry, and an architect, if not the chief architect, of the so-called conflict model of science and religion. In this account, he brought a scientist's eye to the writing of military history. Right up front, Draper proclaimed the great truth that societies advance in a preordained and inevitable course on account of what he described as uncontrollable causes. The chief one, of course, was climate. Like Montesquieu, Draper was convinced that climate exercised its global imperial power through human physiology, and that in turn conditioned different regions' character. It delivered a literal Weltanschauung, a literal worldview. For Draper, zonal climate, bodily organization, and mental character were tightly knitted together, and they therefore translated themselves into distinct economic regimes. The argument now flowed in entirely predictable channels, you'll know it well by now. Draper wanted his readers to see that the differentiation of the American nation into what he called the free and the slave powers had been achieved effectively through the agency of climate. That produced a geopolitical bipolarity ripe for internecine hostility. It's almost incredible to read. A self-conscious democracy was the climate issue in the North, and aristocracy, based upon human slavery, was the climate issue in the South. Climate is all-powerful. It was climate, and I quote him, that had separated the American nation into two sections. It was climate, and I quote, that made a North and a South. It was climate that had cultivated the distinctly marked political instincts of each culture. It could all be captured in a formula approaching a climatic syllogism. This is his general principle. Climate tendencies facilitate the abolition of slavery in a cold country, but oppose it in one that is warm. Now, it's not difficult to discern the appeal of Draper's climatic predestinarianism. What does it do? It delivers explanatory simplicity, political self-justification, and of course ethical absolution. For the sense of eschatological inevitability and humanity's following a script written by climate brought a great sense of moral relief. As Draper put it, now, when we appreciate how much the actions of men are determined by climate and other natural circumstances, our animosities lose much of their asperity, and the return of kind feelings is hastened. Climate's actions had the effect of freeing political history from the burdens of moral accountability. Naturalizing the causes of the Civil War was thus to him a key means of fostering good relations in the post-bellum era, and the hope that what he called a more enlarged, a more enlightened, and in truth a more benevolent view of each other's proceedings may follow. By displaying to the world how climate had ghost-written different histories in the North and South, Draper, and I quote from his biographer, drew the sting from any moral recrimination. Indeed, one might suppose that the chief convenience and possibly the chief defect of the climatic view of history was to bypass ethical concerns altogether. The fusion of climate and conflict had the effect of squeezing culpability entirely out of the picture. Well, I'm beginning to approach the end of this talk. I want now just for a little while to say something about thinking about climate and conflagration and advertise some dissenting views. None of these, may I say, come from anyone who is a climate change denier or climate change skeptic of any kind. The fashion for reducing war to weather has resurfaced with renewed vigour in our own day, stimulated in part by the proclivities of funding agencies and the priorities of national governments. But this reductionist impulse has not met with universal approval. To dissenters, blaming climate for conflict anaesthetises moral accountability and sacrifices human agency to nature's presumed imperatives. A 2002 report for the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety, for instance, it stressed that climate change impacts will not be the single or main causes of future conflicts, and laid emphasis on the mitigating possibilities of cooperation and cooperative strategies. Climate change impacts do not pose a military threat, this report said, nor can they be solved with the traditional mindsets nor by the means of military services. The challenge of climate change might just as easily be the occasion for cooperation as for conflict, for global citizenship rather than the trumpeting of petty nationalisms, for social justice rather than the retention of economic power. Support for this kind of stance has been forthcoming from a number of researchers conducting empirical inquiries into the links in our own day between climate change and civil war. A team of ecologists, based mostly at Colorado State University, for example, has disputed the claim that global warming has increased the risk of civil war in Africa. They argue that attributing such causal powers to climate oversimplifies systems affected actually by many geopolitical and many social factors. And they point out that unrelated geopolitical trends, most notably decolonization and the vicissitudes of the Cold War, which perturbed the political and social landscape of the African continent, tend to be ignored in climatic reductionist accounts. Halvard Bohag, a political scientist at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, has also serious reservations about what I'm calling climatic supremacism. Reworking a range of models used by advocates of climate's determining role in civil wars, he contends that, in fact, climate variability turns out to be a poor predictor of armed conflict, and that civil wars in Africa are far better explained by such conditions as prevalent ethno-political exclusion, poor national economy, and the collapse of the Cold War system. The prehistory of a particular violent episode is relevant too, for as he puts it, recent violence may affect the likelihood of a new conflict breaking out. Investigations of particular regions foster further skepticism about simply reducing conflict to climate. Take the case of Kenya. One recent study set out to test the neo-Malthusian thesis that resource scarcity stimulated by climate change explains the advent of civil war and the outbreak of intergroup violence. That thesis, it noted, defends a popular crisis narrative about sub-Saharan Africa that depicts the continent as miserably resourced and thus prone to violence provoked by periods of drought. Kenya provided a useful test case, since it has been the home, according to this study, to some of the bloodiest civil conflicts in the recent history of the entire continent. Focusing on the period from 1989 to 2004, and using geographically disaggregated data on armed conflicts, the study concluded with the arresting conclusion as follows. Climatic factors do influence the risk of conflicts and violent events, but the effect is opposite to what should be expected from much of the international relations literature. Drought, it turns out, was far from inciting violence, this report argued, arguably had a peaceful effect, a temporary cooling effect on tensions. What emerges as markedly more significant in fueling hostilities are ethnic antipathies, the recent advent of elections, the hope of political gain, not desperate scrambles for scarce land, pasture, and water resources. As the author put it elsewhere, in accounting for violent warfare, an exclusive emphasis on the role of resource scarcity tends to let governments off the hook. Empirical queries like these which challenge the assumption that climate and climate change are the sole or even prime causes of violence, raise troubling concerns about the ease with which an ideology of climatic reductionism has infiltrated its way into national security consciousness. Critics of this determinist turn, and particularly of the Malthusian assumption that increased environmental scarcity and migration weaken states and cause conflict and violence, these critics express grave concerns about the lack of attention devoted to ascertaining the ways that environmental violence reflects or masks other forms of social struggle. For one thing, such scenarios take outbreaks of violence as merely the natural consequence of social evolutionary adaptation. Climate reductionism thus facilitates the sense that war can be, quotes, readily naturalized and depoliticized, with local culture and social relations always relegated to the sidelines. Now, I have no intention of further multiplying testimonials here. In conclusion, let me just refer to one other group of researchers already known for their work on how warmer than normal temperatures can increase the risk of violence in certain places, notably in East Africa. Acutely aware of the perils of a resurgent climatic fatalism, however, they have this to say. Some studies in environmental security are in danger of promulgating a modern form of environmental determinism by suggesting that climate conditions directly and dominantly influence the propensity for violence among individuals, communities, and states. When analysts, they say, neglect the complex political calculus of government and the remarkable ways in which human societies actually do cope with challenging environments, they reach conclusions that are little different from those ascribing poverty to latitudinal location or lessened individual productivity to hot climates, as was common in European and American scholarship about a century ago. And I've tried to demonstrate that with my examples this morning. Such proclivities, these authors believe, are most troubling when they surface among environmental security agencies, who presume that individuals and communities can't engage in positive coping behavior to attenuate climate risks. Human society faces massive challenges in seeking ways to deal with global conflict and with climate change. But if these dissenters are to be believed, society would be better advised striving to weather the blame rather than spending a lot of time trying to blame the weather. Thank you.
Thank you, David. With time for questions, could I ask that sticking out a question from your hand up, and I will come to you with the microphone.
Because we are being recorded, it's for that reason. Simon?
Okay, thanks.
Rupert Reed, UEA. Thanks, David. Look, I agree with a lot of what you've said. I think there were a few kind of low blows along the way. I think it's unfair to punish Diamond by guilt with association with people whose motives were completely different from his. But look, let's say you're basically right. The question is, what do we deduce from it? And I'm nervous about what you may want us to deduce from it, or what others may deduce from it, whether you want them to or not. So it seems to me that what's really useful about the kind of age of consequences stuff is simply that it gives the lie to climate denial.
Yeah.
And it makes absolutely clear the nonsensicality of the position of people like Trump. And we desperately need to face those consequences. The question is only, and I'm sure you'd agree with this, whether we do so humanely or not. Yeah. But it wouldn't be humane to say something like this, or to think something like this. Even when you are highly climate stressed, you can avoid conflict, and to deduce from that mitigation isn't actually that important compared to education, investment in conflict resolution, or what have you. Yeah. And it seems to me that there is a real danger of such a response, which might be called a humanist response, that would risk the hubristic assumption that we can cope with anything, that we're all powerful as long as we choose to be, as long as we cooperate, as long as we're at our best. It seems to me that such a humanist response would be actually profoundly arrogant. It would manifest exactly the kinds of habits of thought that have got us into this terrible trouble, and that it would actually, in the final analysis, be unhumane. So the question is, Are you worried about that kind of possible response? How would you act against it? It seems to me it is entirely possible that that is what will be deduced if arguments such as yours win the day.
Sure. Good. Well, thank you for the question, and of course I agree most entirely with the sentiments that you're putting forward here. What might be deduced from it? I mean, but I think that you're right when you're talking about the Age of Consequences being a polemical document, and a document that is intended as a polemic against those who are climate deniers and so on. And I think that there has to be such a polemic, but it has to be, I think, a fair polemic. I think it has to be one that is not overly dramatized, because if that's the case, then the resort to violence might actually be helped by a document of that sort, since it's predicting the inevitability of climate. The inevitability that climate will bring about violence of one sort and another. It's much more easy to justify it. So I would like to pose the question in a way: what would one deduce from the misuse of polemics, or the use of an overly polemic sort of stance on something? Now, you also said that mine could be in danger of being charged with a kind of humanist arrogance. And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, human agency is never entirely free or divorced from one's genetic makeup, environmental circumstances, political history, and the like. But my concern is the ease with which those are forgotten. I mean, it's just repeating what I've said in the paper. Can I say something about deducing from this more general consequences for academics? At least in the United Kingdom system now, we live in an age of the impact of scholarship. I mean, it's part of our research excellence framework assessment and so on. And I think that in that environment, quite often what happens is that scientists speaking overly dramatize for public consumption and in the public press what might be some of the implications of the research. And I'll give you one example of this. I thought about using this example this morning. Work that was done by paleo-environmentalists on the environmental conditions during the time of the rise of Genghis Khan. This made sort of headline news across the internet with something like "Wet conditions was the greatest weapon in Genghis Khan's armory," explaining his entire kingdom. Can I just say in the 1930s and 40s it was dry conditions that were supposed to do that according to environmental determinists. Now it's wet ones. I went back and read the original article in the National Science Foundation, and it was hedged about with some ifs and buts, consequences and so on. But when those same scientists were interviewed for the media and for the press, all the ifs and buts had disappeared. And it was a dramatic conclusion, overly dramatic, without the careful consequences, because I think they felt the need to be doing something that was seen to be relevant or impactful. And I'm not sure if in the long run that is in the best interest of science or indeed in the best interest of society. But I'm not using anything here to give succor to climate change deniers. I always get asked this question about climate change denying.
But the same exact risk is relevant to you, right? All your ifs and buts may also disappear, and
Correct.
People could quite easily say something like, right, so the message is, what really matters is we need to reduce ethnic rivalries, we need to have conflict resolution, etc. And that would be pretty cataclysmic.
Yeah, and I haven't said that.
No, but how are you going to guard against the ifs and buts being removed from yours?
Well, I'm not going to talk to a journalist and say it's all about agency.
Okay, good.
I'm not going to say it's all about ethnic, but I'm going to say it's about other things as well.
Sure.
But I think that often doesn't happen because you'll not get headlines for it. I think there's some filming going on here this morning. Maybe this is the first chance I've got to say my piece entirely uninterrupted.
Thank you. Any other question over here? I'll go back here and then straight to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Dr. Livingstone. What a fabulous talk. I'm so pleased this is being recorded so that I can watch it again.
I don't want to see it again. And I don't want to see the action replay in slow motion.
Yes, that could be interesting. Yes. I'm Shailen Pupp at the University of Oxford, and I'm part of Department of Education there.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, with that lens really, that how do we educate for this? Because it's so fascinating, but it's so specialist, isn't it? That one has to come to these types of events to really understand things on a deeper level. One has to take an interest. Our education system in many ways is so sophisticated that it doesn't prepare us for these types of realities. Several hundred years ago, we were probably much more able to be prepared to be less dependent on the modern conveniences and things. And I do wonder whether it's easier to avoid thinking about these aspects simply because we're afraid of our lack of preparedness as individuals and as a society. Is there a way in which we could actually have a sophisticated curriculum approach, a sophisticated assessment approach that could prepare individuals for dealing with possible changes that may occur within some decades to come? Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was quite a long question, but it wasn't long enough for me to think of an answer. So my final decision is, yeah, maybe. One would hope so. Just two things that, I mean, I think it's more a plea for having our curriculum modified in some ways. I'm not a specialist at all. I've gone into this as someone who works on the history of ideas, so I don't know really very much about the climate science dimension of it at all. And so I take on trust what the best climate scientists say. But I do think that it's one of the lamentable things, I think, in education is the lack of conversation between the humanities, the social sciences, and the sciences. And I think that I would hope that this morning that at least one way or another, one can't think about climate issues without thinking both about the science and about the ethics that are involved and about human behavior and so on. So I would like to see more courses that integrate materials of this sort. I happen to work in a school where there are climate scientists and physical scientists, as well as people studying aspects of the humanities and social sciences, and we don't always get along all that well. We're suspicious of each other and so on. But when I do have a climate change question, I have someone I can go and ask about it. So I just think if there were more opportunities to think about these problems in holistic ways rather than increasingly specialist ones, that would be good. And this is why I think a meeting like this, which combines academics and others who are not academics, is a very useful thing to have. But I have no secret elixir as to how to transform the curriculum to be able to do this. I would just hope people would do so. Michael had a question here, I think.
David, I'm fascinated by the resonance with the evolutionary story.
Yes.
With all of these evolutionists of the 19th century explaining the fact that the reason why we white people have got bigger brains than black people is precisely because the struggle was much tougher in, in Bedford than it was in
Belfast.
Yes, right. Than in the Congo. And I'm wondering to what extent you actually see the same people writing on these, people appealing, cross-appealing in this, what should we say, from evolution to, what should we call this, ecology, something like that, and back and forth. I mean, that's a question, not a, this is not a criticism, just a question.
Yeah. I think there's a huge amount, and if I've got your question right, there are two dimensions to it. I mean, I think there's a huge amount of Darwinian vocabulary that's in this entire debate, mostly Malthusian, translated in through sort of natural selection and adaptationism and so on. There's a fair amount of popular Lamarckism in here too, as you will probably know better than I. But there's also an interesting crossover between the 19th century writers and 21st century writers. In the mid-20th century, 1940, 50, 60, and so on, Ellsworth Huntington's writings, that's the crude environmental determinist, were not only criticized but lampooned in the academy. They were thought to totally downplay human agency. They were also thought to be racially troublesome. They were bound up, this story about climate was bound up with the eugenics movement and so on. And yet I've been amazed in the 2010, 15 and so on, there's still a continuing resort to Huntington's writings with the claim, of course, that they're not importing the racial material, but nonetheless his basic science is still coming through in modern writings. And you mentioned about brains. I thought you were going to compare not Belfast and not Bedford and Beirut, but Bedford and Belfast. You know, we're a lot wetter. You know, someone said our temperament is the result of bad weather and a diet of potatoes in Ireland. But,
it's just too warm.
But what I've discovered is the business about brains. There are a number of climate scientists, amazingly, saying things like, if global climate increases by 1 degree, it will cook our brains. And then I think there are some places in the world where it's already a degree higher than we are here. So, I mean, it's that kind of sloppy language that one, you know, I think this is an appeal to be more careful, is what I'm really trying to say. So I think there are a lot of resonances, Michael, and actually I suspect you know about them more than I do.
Can I just make one follow-up comment?
Yeah, sure.
And I think this is pertinent to where we are here, is, as you know, one of the things I'm very interested in as a you is the extent to which one moves from, let's say, straight professional science to this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
To Gaia,
to,
as you know, to talking about war.
Indeed.
And I'm absolutely fascinated to see how there is, you know, there really are some good scientists working on climate, and they know things which are true.
Absolutely.
And yet then you move up here, and it's so interesting to me the extent to which the tropes and metaphors of religion, and not necessarily the Anglican, you know, although it can be, as in Darwin's case, but it's fascinating to me to see how quickly one moves from the basic professional science to, well, as I say, science as religion, with secular religion. And I'm fascinated to see this as a perfect case study.
Well, I think also there are forces that are, as I was trying to say earlier, pushing scientists in that direction. And one of these is to do with what impact is government investment in science having back on the society. And that forces scientists again and again to find an application, so that when you're now applying to many of the research funding agencies, unless you have a practical outcome, unless you have, you know, and people are running out an exhibition at a museum or claiming this, that, and the other, they will not get funded. The other thing that's interesting about that, I should just say in passing, is that paleo-environmentalists seemed to discover that ancient climate change had produced the human brain, that's a quote, exactly at the time when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change were bringing out its results. So you wonder what was driving the science funding agenda, reflecting what's going on right now. And then an area that had never thought about this before, suddenly, if it wants to get a grant, has to have climate change built into it. And for a while, the National Science Foundation was operating that way. There's a social history of science, which you and I know about.
Another question back here.
Yeah.
Hi, Sally Annett. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
I was struck by the very interesting narrative that you had created, and would be interested to know who are the IR links that are making, you know, there were a few. When you're talking about constructive narratives, I felt that yours was a highly constructive narrative, and was wondering what it was meant to elicit in me as a listener, because clearly there's a huge interconnected network of causes. You could take Apoduri's 5 landscapes and add in medicalisation as a 6th aspect, all of those kind of things. But it seems to be a battle about resources, and climate is hugely impactful on resources. We are, you know, connected to the environment. So somewhere in that was lost for me. That and perhaps oversimplified, and perhaps potentially insulting to certain people who would not wish to be portrayed as upholding sort of eugenics beliefs from the 18th century.
Well, I think there are 3 things I would say about this. First of all, what response am I trying to elicit from you? I mean, I'm just trying to elicit care. That's all. I'm not pushing particular line on this. I'm saying that there have been overstatements, and I wonder if those overstatements have done as much damage as anything else. Of course, I'm not accusing all international relations people as adopting eugenics, but I'm pointing out that there is a history here, and that being aware of this history is not unimportant in how we're conducting affairs right now, especially if you're going back to writers who were so directly connected with the eugenics movement, as in this case, he was the president of the American Eugenics Society. I think that's not unimportant to know in the present generation. But my constructed narrative, of course, is a constructed narrative, and it's a narrative that comes from a much wider project that I'm working on. And because you've asked, this is not intended to be insulting to anybody at all. My narrative revolves around a history that I want to write of the idea that climate is the main determinant of human culture. This story today is about apocalypse and war. I have a comparable story about human wealth. I have a comparable story about health. I have another story I want to write about mental health. I have a story I want to write about climate change and evolution. I'm really interested in what I'm calling climate reductionism. It's a history of the inclination to reduce human life to nothing but climate. Other people think we're reduced to nothing but genes. Other people think we're reduced to nothing but synaptic firing in the brain. There are a whole species of these, and I'd love to write them, but I'm about to retire and I'm never going to get them done. So this is just one chapter or one section out of a series of 7 or 8 reductionisms that I'm trying to write, and I maybe should have said that at the beginning, because that has sort of can I say, constructed or at least steered the narrative in the direction that I've been putting
Thank you. That makes much more sense then.
Good. I'm glad.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Time for one more, I think.
Anybody? Okay. Last question.
Thought you were going to give me a break.
My name's Steve Dolan. I just happen to be a local. But
Steve,
I'm not from the humanities side way back when. Academically, I'm from the science side of nuclear physics. But what strikes me, a lot that's been said around scientists being indiscreet as they speak to the media.
Yeah.
I recognise that, but I also struggle a bit with the use of the word scientist in that context.
Oh, yeah.
Science studies stuff and seeks to do so by, should we say, rational means.
Yeah.
You can shoot me down, but that's an overgeneralisation, I know. People are engaged in that activity. Yeah. Once they are no longer engaging in that activity, is it useful to call them scientists? They are part of the general population who happen to have a particular background. And it's something I find very difficult, not today, but listening to the press, listening to the radio, the press. Scientists say this, that, and t'other. Yeah. And it's always not actually what they said. Yeah. It's usually a summary of what they perhaps injudiciously said, moving from their scientific professionalism into trying to communicate with the wider world. And I think that's, speaking from the part of, as an ex-scientist, I do find that a bit wearying at times. But more generally, could I say that, yes, that's very telling how you've presented all of this. But to my eye, what it's saying is that positive historicism and all that, black and white solutions are what it's all about. These analyses can only be partial. They have to recognise, perhaps they don't, but I'm sure that it is recognised there are other factors as well. Yeah. It's highlighting a possible influence of the one. Yeah. And around today's discussion, climate is a very dodgy word, because I would say climate has driven bits of civilization in a way you haven't touched on at all. Sure. And that's that massive, great climatic gift to Saudi Arabia that sits under the Arabian Peninsula.
Good. Thank you.
Big question.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of things by way of response. You describe yourself as an ex-scientist. Human beings could describe themselves as ex-apes. Actually, not a bad way to put it. Can I just say two things? I think I'm being interpreted here as gunning for the scientists, and well, I am. But I also have a feeling that scientists in their institutions are expected to court the media now. They are sort of expected, and you know, I think it's really important that we should communicate. Scientists should communicate with the public. I think the public pays their salary and so on. But my concern is when they feel they have to over-dramatize what they've found. I mean, on the website of my university, you'd think that every day we were finding a new cure for cancer. You know, dramatic new event, you know, and I mean, the cancer survival rates aren't great in Northern Ireland, really. So, I don't know where the claims are coming from. But so I think that there's something in how government and research funding agencies and so on expect certain things from scientists, and part of that is a fear now about what you might call useless science. A wonderful book came out a few years ago called "The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge." You never know the value of the knowledge, maybe until 20, 30 years or whatever. And pushing people into saying this is what it is now, I just think, personally, I think that is a mistake. But I'm hesitant, I have to say, about definitions. You say that when a scientist is doing that, they're not being a scientist anymore. And it could take the rest of this conference to come up with an agreed upon definition of science. We've one person in the room who tried to get a definition of this in an American court of law, and he and I have disagreed, right, Michael, on what your definition of science to that court really was. I wouldn't also like it to be thought that science is ever purely and irreducibly a cognitive activity. Scientists, practicing science, are human beings. Aspects of their humanity, their gender, their background, enter into the laboratory. And I think that we should just always be aware that there can be a spillover from those social dimensions into the scientific work. On the other hand, I'm far from reducing science to merely being social relations or anything of that sort. But thank you for your observations. I think they're really important observations, that especially in an era when climate science or various other sciences are in the public eye, we really need to exercise a lot of care.
Thank you. David
Okay,
Livingstone.
Simon.
We're going to take a short break now, stretch legs, have coffee, and reconvene in 20 minutes back here. Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. I was actually thinking. Sorry, I crossed that down a bit.
think I tried to tell you.
Yeah. But yeah. Yes. Yeah. How do you see it?
There are some upsides as well. Well, at the moment, the upsides are going to
So the one is
And the whole management committee as well, they were like, oh, you thought the term of the world.
That's better than I'm not in my head.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Thank you so much.
We have 4 people who are things mainly can't make it, so they've got a week meeting and finalised and yes, yeah. So you can through Satan or if you go on YouTube and search for Satan, all the stuff over the previous conferences there. Saying that we can the live long session for each day, and then we're going to spend that individual conversations. Yeah. So you had to still project to be able to go at the front of the gallery, but then at the back of the gallery, voice was also coming through. So they're very quiet microphones. So you still got yeah. I don't know if you noticed when Simon brought across, there was some feedback on the system. And the reason for that was because I muted his microphone, so we could pick up voice from the depth. And then I told him if you got to unpause it, so in the text and around his back, they were trying to make sure that was the image voice.
question you asked last. It was the same, more or less the same question I had myself. But it's obviously a regular one, yes.
Yes.
And it's been mobilised or denied.
Yes. It's it. See, I think that we're nearly all in denial, and I worry about mobilising. Maybe I should have stressed that more. Not so much, Trumpian nonsense. There's a subtle denial that says, well, the problem isn't really that bad, but we're human beings, we can do anything.
To work with nuance, but nuance is very quickly mobilised for the wrong kind of scepticism by deniers. Well, it could be this, or it could be this.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. It's kind of what I'm writing on at the moment. So
What are you doing?
I'm lecturing philosophy and religious studies at Pastoral.
Oh yeah.
But I'm reading kind of environmental humanities, so I kind of the manuscript that's been going on for several years. It's
right. Oh right. Well, yes. Yeah. Why don't you take one of these? This is the project that our think tank Greenhouse are doing about replacement for how bad climate change is.
So where are you based, Rupert?
So I teach at University of East Anglia.
Okay.
This is a greenhouse. Do you know Sean Sullivan?
Yes, very well, yes, his colleagues.
She's written for us.
There's a draft over there, so. Yeah, with a black kid, no less.
You've been determined by climate?
Yes, that's right.
It's the global warming conference. Frequently quizzed.
Where more than other people because I ride a bike.
Thanks for get another stress.
Where are you staying?
And yet I gather last week you had some of the hottest weather you've ever
We
had.
had over 13 degrees. I think it was 13 degrees.
You're in the philosophy department, do you, Stanley?
I am.
What is your, I mean, apart from this, what is your speciality? What's your area?
So I do lots of stuff. I do this stuff. I also do Wittgenstein.
What?
Wittgenstein, Rupert Wittgenstein, philosophy of language. And I do philosophy of film.
Film.
Yeah.
I've been teaching philosophy and film to an honours programme for the last 15 years.
Yeah.
And the great thing is, in America, that as long as you're present, the instructor's present, there are no copyright restrictions at all. So we can show anything that we want without any worries whatsoever.
Yeah. Yes. Is it not similar here?
It probably is, but in America there's so many rules and regulations.
Yeah, I know. I did my PhD at Rutgers outside Livingstone. I was astonished to find that the land of the free was really the land of the bureaucrats.
Anyhow, I start off with shame.
Welcome back, everybody. I will be, so we've got one change in the programme today. Benjamin Huskinson is unfortunately ill, and so he won't be able to join us. But that does mean that there's a little bit more room in terms of allowing questions and so on and so forth. I will be, for presenters, I'll let people know when there are 5 minutes left.
Does that mean we can go over 20 minutes?
Only a little bit. I'll let you know when there's 5 minutes left and when your time is up, okay? And so, pleasure to introduce Rupert Reed. Rupert.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Simon. It's great to be here. It's really exciting. So I'm going to try to explore the logic of what's been called civilizational succession with you. The concept is loosely modelled on that of ecological succession. But first, I need to very briefly convince you of the severity of the problem that we confront. Maybe I'm hoping I don't need to do very much of that with this audience. I'll merely draw attention to the Cristina Figueres letter that probably many of you saw yesterday, basically saying we've got 3 years left to stop ourselves going beyond 2 degrees of global overheat. And as is well known, if we go beyond 2 degrees, we may well get onto a conveyor belt that pushes us up eventually towards 6 degrees and possibly a lot more. So that raises the question, will we do this? Will we as a species make this unprecedented change within the next 3 years? It seems to me that before the advent of Trump, the chances of us doing so were extremely low, and they may have been slightly improved in that people are now kind of angry and trying to pull together against Trump, but they've also been massively unimproved because we've got Trump and his policies. So will we do this? I very much hope he will. I'm totally with those who are trying to make us do it, but I think it is unlikely that we will do it. So I think that, to say the least, I think that we need to face up to climate reality, which, funnily enough, is the name of the project which my think tank, Greenhouse, has recently embarked on. And I have 4 copies here for lucky, keen people in the audience of our introductory report to our project. Anyone who wishes to claim one, come and get one afterwards to find out all about it, or it's freely available on our website. So what hope is there of us changing this situation where, as I say, the prognosis, it seems to me, is that the chances of us actually doing what is necessary, this unprecedented transformation or transition, are very slim. What hope is there of this situation changing? What kind of radical, unexpected events, what kind of white or black swan could lead us to a situation where our civilization is not under mortal threat? It seems to me that the one which is most in the air at the moment is the populist wave on the left. Quite a lot of people are hoping that because of the rise of people like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn and others in other countries, Podemos and so on, maybe there's a chance of people rising to power really soon who are going to be able to put us onto a radically different course. I think this hope is an extremely vain one. On the left, there is today a deathly embrace of the same old gods of production, progress, and growthism. And there is also now an endless journey into liberal individualist identity consumerism. The latter is a particularly worrying trend for us here, thinking about the climate. And I now direct your attention to your handouts. Does everyone have a handout? You've all got a handout? Everyone inside one of these? Yeah? So I'm going to skip over quote 1, which is just sort of generally to frame the thing, and take you to quotation number 2. This is a very famous statement from the Combahee River Collective of black feminists, who are the people who introduced the term identity politics. And you see, it's a simple sentence. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. So this thought may have been fine and even perhaps entirely necessary for black women at that time, trying, understandably and rightly, to make feminism more representative. But it is a dangerous idea in terms of blocking or deprobabilifying projects of assembling majorities for socio-political transformation. And it is a cataclysmic idea for animal rights, for environmentalism, and for activism on behalf of future people. For these movements are by definition concerned with working to end somebody else's oppression. climate action stands by definition against the notion that the most radical thing is to work to end your own oppression. The narcissism of extreme identity politics involves a systematic retreat into the present day and into the self. It motivates idiocies that I've heard, such as people saying things like, well, we don't really know what future generations will need, and it's presumptuous to speak for them. Therefore, we should focus on the present, we should focus on liberating ourselves. So much for identity politics. We're also deeply possessed on the left by the idea that things have been getting better and better and are going to keep on getting better and better. We're deeply possessed by the ideology of progress, and that brings us to quotation number 3, which I'll touch on just very briefly. This is from Ishigo's masterful work, which I hope many of you know, Never Let Me Go, which was also made into a film. The scenario, Never Let Me Go, is you have a future where everything's brilliant because medicine has advanced so far that everybody leads really long, illness-free lives. There's just one catch, which is that you have to have a class of people whose organs are harvested in order for this wonderful future to eventuate. And towards the end of the novel, this is kind of the denouement, one of the main characters sums up in this wonderful way how very difficult it is to row back from this wonderful utopian, dystopian future. Quote, "There was no way to reverse the process. How can you ask a world that has come to regard cancer as curable? How can you ask such a world to put away that cure, to go back to the dark days? There was no going back. Even if the cost, in the case of this fictive scenario, is the appalling human cost I just mentioned, or in our case, even if the cost is to crash the entire system. I think it's going to be unbelievably difficult to ask people to give up the idea of ever-improving ultra-high-tech healthcare, not to mention our mobiles and a million other things. The left is totally bought into the ideology of progress, and it's going to be very hard to find a way out of it. And then let's turn explicitly to growth, the engine of so-called progress, and turn to quotation number 4. So I've got here a few little tiny quotes for you from the recent Labour manifesto, in which absolutely front and centre is faster economic growth. And this, they don't even pretend that this is going to be so-called green growth, which is in any case a fantasy. They say our industrial strategy is one for growth across all sectors. If we were going to transform this civilization and save ourselves, we would already have something like green governments in 2017. We're so far from this situation that the idea is almost laughable. I see absolutely no reasonable basis for the notion that left or progressive governments, even if they could come to power in the next few years, will save us. We need some much more radical change, which is not on the cards. We need, for example, a doctrine which I call enoughism, the idea that we don't have to have endless growth. We don't have to have endless so-called progress. We don't have to have endless development. There's a stage at which we will say, that's enough. This is a radical transformation of a kind which we have never experienced before. So we have to take very seriously the likelihood that we will face at least some degree of runaway climate change, all other things being equal, possibly, of course, including releasing the methane, in which case the runaway will not be even stoppable. In this context, it seems to me that civilizational succession is our best option. It's the best that we can realistically hope for. It's not like a kind of last resort. It's actually the best realistic hope. We must face the strong likelihood of this civilization coming to an end in an unplanned way. And that brings me to quotation number 5 from my handout from the great William Offells from his recent masterful little book, Immoderate Greatness, Why Civilizations Fail. Quote, "Just as prudent mariners carry lifeboats and practice abandoning ship, a global civilization in its terminal phase would be well advised to prepare arks, storehouses, and banks, designed to preserve the persons, tools, and materials with which to retain or reconstitute some semblance of civilized life post-collapse." That, it seems to me, is a key task that we have today. We need to seed what might be a viable successor civilization from out of the brilliance and squalor and ruins of this one. We need to model the genuine communities to come. This is why the transition movement, permaculture, and so on are so important. At a smaller scale still, on a personal, homestead, neighborhood scale. What this also means is that we need to prep for the possibility of seriously bad and hard times ahead. At a much larger scale, and above all perhaps, we need what myself and my students are calling a new imaginary, a new way of conceiving ourselves in the world, getting away from those old ideologies and assumptions of progress, growth, and so on. The new imaginary will probably include notions of embeddedness, of enough, and of long-termism. It would be an imaginary capable of being the philosophical and ethical kernel of the new civilization that could follow our global civilization. Assuming that our self-destruction is not absolutely total, what forms of political and social organization emerge out of a world with a seriously degraded climate is the important question. And the political and intellectual battle never ends, precisely because the future is open and still to be made. Now, we need somehow to do all this while being all too aware of the very strong likelihood that the new civilization will have to pass through a most unholy baptism of fire, the fire of global overheat, and the fire of the resource wars and desperate migrations and extreme turbulence that will accompany it. You will have noticed, by the way, that whereas the previous speaker was concerned about over-dramatization, I'm concerned about under-dramatization. I'm concerned about the very serious risk, which I think is almost omnipresent, that virtually all of us, virtually all the time, are in denial about the seriousness of the prospect that we face. And that it's very easy to kind of castigate a fool like Trump. And it's very easy to miss the extent to which we actually share a great deal in common with him in terms of actually assuming that we don't have to radically transform our civilization. The transitional period is reasonably likely to be a long and dire emergency, a nightmare compared to which the suffering involved in previous world wars may come, incredibly, to seem relatively minor. We have to try to start to construct some of the potential elements of a successor civilization, both ideational and practical, in such a way that we can survive this baptism of fire and not be corrupted in the process. And when you stop for a moment to think this point through, it makes our task even harder. For if there is to be a civilization to succeed this one, it will have to be tough enough to survive, without being turned wholly vicious. It will have to be tough enough to survive a time that is quite likely literally to test humanity more severely by far than we've been tested before. The signs in terms of things like our willingness to be caring to refugees, including climate refugees, which we already have, are, to say the least, thus far rather mixed. There have to be lifeboats, but how does one build lifeboats that are not so viciously exclusive that they undermine their own worth? Perhaps the task then is not even as easy as building just one new civilization. Perhaps we need to plan on two in sequence, and again, this is why I talk about civilizational succession. Perhaps the real task is to build a lifeboat now, for us, is to start to think about building a lifeboat civilization, a decent and yet realistic and pragmatic ethic, unafraid to be determined to survive at most, not all, costs. A civilization that can carry some of us through the storms of our children, and that can somehow carry within it the seeds of a future successor, less harsh civilization that might exist and truly flourish in a less awfully pressed time that we might one day be able to recover to. So much as some knowledge and wisdom survived the Middle Ages in monasteries, so perhaps a key task now for us is to create what some have called ecosteries. Seed banks, both literal and metaphorical, for a possible future civilization to come once this one has demised and we've transitioned entirely beyond it. A superb fictive model for these ecosteries might be Margaret Atwood's Gardeners in her post-climatic disaster novel After the Flood. If this is our task, creating two future civilizations in sequence, then it is even harder than I made it appear earlier. We may have to make some pretty awful compromises even to be able to seed a future civilization at all. The lifeboat civilization may not be pretty, because if a lifeboat is to float, eventually one will have to stop letting people aboard. The trick will be somehow to survive without becoming vicious, and somehow to carry forward a torch for a kinder, more civil future within that survival. A great fictive model for this is The Child in the Road, the novel and film that I'm sure many of you know, and the superb idea that he develops of carrying the fire. To make any headway with any of this, conferences like this are important, because we have to face climate reality collectively if we are really to face it at all. Václav Havel penned in his great essay, The Power of the Powerless, some deeply wise words that speak directly to our condition of having to face a difficult reality. His idea of living in truth seems particularly pertinent for times when post-truthism, a product of consumerism applied to ideas and therethrough to reality itself, has absurdly become widespread at the very time when reality is about to bite us harder than it ever has done before. See on this, on the handout, quotation number 6. I shan't read it out, but it's a beautifully powerful exposition of the kind of situation that we're in, it seems to me. These words of Havel's resonate, it seems to me. They diagnose us. They offer us a challenge to rise to now. In the same essay, Havel wrote something that seems to me to carry over even more directly to our own predicament today. He spoke of the state's desperate attempt to plug up the dreadful wellspring of truth, a truth which might cause incalculable transformations in social consciousness. We might add also corporations' desperate efforts to plug up the dreadful wellspring of truth. So the question is, do we dare to seek to cause an incalculable transformation in social consciousness? One that might be enough yet to radically transform this civilization, or rather more likely, to see the new civilization, the civilization or civilizations worth birthing from this one's death throes. Havel spoke of the totalitarian effort to defend the integrity of the world of appearances in order to defend itself. Are we willing and able to stop engaging in such defense and to unmask it, to stop defending ourselves against reality and truth itself? Havel wrote that the moment someone breaks through in one place, when one person cries, "The emperor is naked," when a single person breaks the rules of the game, thus exposing it as a game, everything suddenly appears in another light, and the whole crust seems then to be made of a tissue on the point of tearing and disintegrating uncontrollably. Can we be the ones to cry out that the emperor is naked? I admit, not a pretty picture applied to the emperor of the US, but in any case. The East Bloc regimes proved astoundingly fragile. Perhaps then we might hope that our civilization's hegemony, its death embrace with the insanity of perpetual industrial growthism, is less assured, less solid than it seems. Perhaps it might yet melt into air. This seems, however, decidedly unlikely. One can take some hope from all sorts of movements of liberation in history, from the Velvet Revolutions to most recently Jeremy Corbyn's remarkable showing in the 2017 UK general election. But we have absolutely no precedent for a revolutionary radical transformation that centrally involves long-termism and care for the voiceless, rather than some kind of liberation of ourselves or of some human group. The closest there is to such a precedent appears to be the way that the surviving prehistoric future eaters, described by Tim Flannery in the eponymous book, which I much recommend to those of you who don't know it, the future eaters, superb metaphor, which he applies back to the prehistoric peoples who destroyed their megafauna and applies also to ourselves. The prehistoric future eaters seem to have managed to learn from their destruction of the megafauna and of their own ecosystems, and to have left to many of their indigenous descendants ways of living harmoniously and lightly on the earth. But note, they had to go through terrible population crashes, as well as animal extinctions, and extinctions of entire groups who probably decimated their own environments beyond the point of no return, and were therefore eliminated from the gene pool. They had to go through all of this in order to learn this painful knowledge. Now, we may have been hoping that there would be a precedent for the revolutionary transformation that we are in need of without such pain and destruction, but one is not in evidence. Moreover, if we do thoroughly crash our civilization, then the danger is that it will take down almost everything necessary for any large-scale civilization with it. The collapse may well be global and virtually complete, as suggested, for example, by James Lovelock in The Revenge of Gaia, and perhaps, therefore, even irrecoverable. So, we need to reach much higher and longer than we have ever done so before. So, friends and colleagues, I hope we will. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Any questions? Oh, over here. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Rupert. I found myself agreeing with nearly everything you said, which obviously might raise the question, have I got a question? to proclaim on this, we can rather feel like modern Cassandras. You know, it almost seems a wasted endeavour to, you know, to make these proclamations. Just a quick question though: any civilization to come will exist in a world of less and less, unlike previous civilizations where they've started elsewhere and new resources have been opened up. But we're going to be encountering less and less stuff. So if we do survive, this is obviously a problem. There's going to be less resources. But my main question is, the lifeboat metaphor, it assumes that someone will come along and rescue you. So is this really the best metaphor? Because a lifeboat is just transitory, and then you expect a boat to come along and pick you up. Whereas, is it going to be like that? It doesn't seem that it will be. So.
Yes, so in that sense, the lifeboat metaphor may again be too optimistic. I guess one's thinking of something like a lifeboat where what one does is get in the lifeboats and then rows to shore, something like that. Prophecy, yes. Cassandra, yes. But remember that, as David pointed out, it's always important to remember that these are never pure prophecies in the sense of fatalistic prophecies. One of the reasons one does this kind of thing, for example, is to try to help people to wake up. Which I think it's very, very difficult for us to really wake up and face the situation that we're in. So it's not really exactly prophecy. It's more the creation of scenarios and then the attempt to try to decide which scenario we're going to try to actualize. But I totally agree with you that it can feel very much as if one is, obviously one is saying things that hardly anyone wants to hear. Right, including oneself, and therefore, in some sense, it's quite lonely. But therefore, I think it's especially important to do this kind of thing. And what I'm hoping and thinking, sitting here, feeling quite nervous and exposed, is that this is an opportunity to build or find a little community and to feel a bit less desperate and desolate. As a result. This is the point of finishing with the quotation number 8 on the handout, which I just sort of leave you with as a sort of au revoir. Paul Gingsnorth's very challenging thoughts that there is an abyss open before us, and we have to look into it. And that I think is our test here today.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I agree with you that the Labour Party manifesto was nothing like radical enough on this and many other things. But the question I want to put to you is something you mentioned in passing, is that the transition movement is so important. And I just wonder whether you just say a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses you see from the point of view of all that you've been saying this morning about the transition movement and what it offers us.
Great, thank you. So, firstly, a word more on Labour. Really, in a way, the point that I'm making is that Labour under Corbyn and Sanders, in terms of what we're talking about here, they haven't even got to first base. Right? They're nowhere. In fact, they might even be worse than nowhere, because although there's good environmental stuff in Labour's manifesto and in Sanders' programme, it's got good stuff about not building oil pipelines and so on and so forth. They call for faster economic growth, and they don't even pretend that it's going to be so-called green growth, which doesn't even exist anyway. Right? So, a very senior friend of mine in the Green Party used to make a little joke. This is sort of between ourselves. I know we're being filmed here, but anyway, some years ago she said, "Vote Tory, save the planet," and what she meant by that is that the Conservatives are often so bad, actually, and the Republicans in the States so bad at managing the economy that they often cause less economic growth than Labour or Democrat governments. I mean, you look at the 1990s in the United States and compared to the 2000s, it's absolutely fascinating that Clinton has, these half-decent environmental regulations. Bush comes along, strips out the regulations. You think, how desperately bad to have a Republican president. But Bush was so rubbish at managing the economy in the interest of growth compared to Clinton, that if you actually look at the totality of environmental indicators in the Clinton years and the Bush years, it was worse in the Clinton years, because the faster growth undid the environmental regulations, more than undid them. So Corbyn and Sanders might be worse than nothing in terms of what we're interested in here. In terms of the transition movement, so I've written about this, and you can find it on the web if you want. I've debated it with Rob Hopkins. I think the transition movement is brilliant and absolutely necessary. I think, however, unfortunately, it's a serious mistake to think that the transition movement is enough, because the transition movement can only work in the context of the right political framework. And the reason why is that if what you have is a lot of people transitioning and a lot of other people not transitioning, then the people who are transitioning, using less oil and so on and so forth, all they succeed in doing is sending a massive price signal to the others. It's fine to consume even more oil, even more quickly. In other words, the price is low. And it looks like we're going to be seeing some of that at the moment. The price of oil is relatively low, so lots of things become economically viable to use that oil for, which otherwise weren't. Transition is absolutely essential, but as a demonstration, as a series of demonstration projects, and as a way of preparing ourselves for the potentiality of actual collapse, right? In terms of a scenario for transforming our civilization, transition cannot possibly be enough. So if we're trying to think about a transformational scenario, we have to get the politics right. As I said, we're not even at first base on that. So if we think beyond that to the likelihood of collapse and back to the lifeboat civilization type scenario, then transition becomes vital as a way of starting to kind of tool us up and prepare us. So it's a kind of macro scale prepping. And it's also a way of actually modeling, again, the ideology of enough, enoughism, which again relates to the previous question, right? This again is a hugely challenging aspect of what we face. We are going to have a future in which, for the first time in a long time, people are going to have to be used to having less. Is that always going to be conceived of as a constraint, as something regrettable? In which case, we're simply setting ourselves up for further and worse fails. Or can we manage somehow to embrace it? Can we manage somehow to think, yeah, it's actually a good thing not to have too much? If we can, then again, transition is going to be hugely, hugely important in making that happen.
Thank you very much indeed. I just have a question. I mean, there's so many things that you've raised, but about how do you get a hearing for what you're saying? Because you really attack some sacred cows. And thinking about the left, I mean, the left to me seems very much hijacked by what I would call a kind of ideology of economism that, as you said, it's obsessed with things like growth and
production.
On the news, yes, and on the news, we're meant to be, for some reason, it's more important for us to know how a high street supermarket has done, what its returns are this year, than various other things that I would say are rather more pressing about the world. So, and the left doesn't seem to critique that. And when you criticised identity politics, I'm sure you must have experienced this, but I know this from a rather different position, quite the kind of vilification, anybody criticising some of the contemporary turn to identity politics would get, to the point in which you won't get a hearing at all, you may get shut down or potentially even find yourself on the wrong side of the law over some of these sorts of issues. So I just wonder, you mentioned the transition movement and said that really at best that's a kind of prefigurative sort of thing, not an answer. But how do you envisage getting a hearing for this? I mean, this is an unusual forum, but how does it become get any kind of cultural momentum?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really, really important. So I've given talks on elements of what I've given talks on here today, and I've written stuff about it and published articles and stuff about it before. I've never before today come right out and put it all together in this way and said anything quite as radical. I chose to do so because of the very specific nature of this event. And also because I've come to think over the last year that our situation is sufficiently desperate that my previous caution I should try to find ways of starting to throw it to the wind. I still don't feel ready to publish this, at least not with my own name attached to it. So I'm only part way, but I'm inching into the pond. In terms of the sacred cows, I mean, absolutely, and this is part of what makes the situation so desperate. Growth is hegemonic, progress is hegemonic, development is hegemonic, identity politics is hegemonic. I got to the point of thinking one has to speak out on identity politics because of the precise point that I made. You have this wonderful sounding statement by the Combahee River Collective And we've had the huge and ever-growing tranche of identity politics ever since. And you think about it and you realize that that's just incompatible with climate activism. So something has to give. Well, I think it better be that identity politics gives. Because if what gives is the climate, then all bets are off. So yeah, I think we have to start to face up to these things. I don't know how one gets a hearing for them. I would love ideas from those minds assembled here. I think we have to try to start to work this out together if we're going to get anywhere at all in this incredibly challenging task.
Thank you very much.
Time for one more question, Susanna.
Hi, thank you. First of all, I want to say just that I do agree with you, but I want to know if you have any ideas about what this succession of new civilizations will look like. So from my own research, there are two basic frameworks that I see in terms of people who are thinking along your lines, although maybe not with the same notions of climate. So I've done work amongst preppers, and I noticed you kept using the word to prep. So these are people who are working on the household level in energy independence for that house with solar panels and getting their own water. So there's that very, very micro scale of survival. So the civilization will literally be independent households. And the other one that I see quite prevalent is this idea that technology is going to save us. You know, we're going to go into space, fully automated luxury communism style. And I just wanted to see if you had looked at those strategies and if those were kind of things that you would see as viable or not, and if so, what would you see as this viable new civilization?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So, yes, you noticed that I spoke about prepping. I think we should all be prepping. I mean, I'm prepping in my small, pathetic way. Examples, I've got lots of money under my mattress. I mean, it's not literally under my mattress. But I would encourage you all to have lots of money somewhere, not under your mattress. I mean cash. I've got a bulletproof vest. I've got lots of cans in the loft. Is any of this going to do me any good? Probably not, but it's a little start. Of course, the problem with the preppers considered as a movement is their extreme individualism and their depoliticization. What it seems to me we need to do is start to actually try to combine all of these things to have a prepping that kind of fits with transition, that fits with green political movements, that fits with building a new imaginary, which should, I think, have philosophical and spiritual aspects. That's a big task, but yeah, I think that prepping is part of the solution. As for technophilia, I think it's no part of the solution. I think it's an absolute catastrophe. It's, again, absolutely hegemonic. And fully automated luxury communism, catastrophic idea, very attractive to people on the left, in utter fantasy. Elon Musk, it seems to me, is another complete disaster zone. He's doing some good things, some good technological innovations, but he gives people this completely fatal idea that, well, all you need to do is empower people like him, and everything's going to be taken care of. And you can tell how catastrophic his ideas are when you look at some of the things that people don't hear about so much that he believes in. For example, he believes that we don't actually exist. He believes that we're almost certainly in a matrix. And this is extreme, this is extreme anti-materialism, extreme avoidance of facing reality. And some of the things he's actually doing, like space tourism. I mean, if you want to have one direct route to frying our climate forever, space tourism is that route. So that's Elon Musk. And all of this stuff all this technophilia is just a search for what Jean-Paul Sartre called a reprieve. It's just people wanting to think, someone else is going to take care of this. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to change anything. I don't have to change my lifestyle. Right? That's why everyone hopes that technology is going to save us. Technology is absolutely not going to save us. Of course, technological improvements are one part of the solution, like solar panels. Of course, that's one part of what we need to do. Although we should question the fetishization of the industrialization, the industrial rollout of them, right? It's not clear that the very large-scale rolling out of solar panels and of wind turbines is a good idea. It looks more like it's just a desperate attempt to keep the mega machine rolling forward. So it should be something closer to the way that transitioners and indeed some preppers are thinking about it. We've got to have an idea of enough, right? Without some kind of idea of enough, all that technophilia is going to do is going to push things, kick the can a little bit further down the road, and is going to lead to an even more dire collapse.
Thank you, Rupert. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mike. Stay in your seats, Michael. Svoboda is up next.
I'm pleased to have the opportunity to participate in the forum. This was a chance to extend some work I had done previously. So let me begin by kind of playing with or explaining my title. Cine-atheisia is is a play on synesthesia, which is having more than one sort of cognitive response to a sensory input, where one could see sounds or smell sights. So I'm kind of wondering what else is coming along with attempts to represent climate change in cinema. I'm dealing with more than Hollywood here, so Hollywood is a metonymy. Although most of the films are American, they're not all major productions. And based on a prior study I had done, I kind of noticed that religion was more or less not engaged in these films. So absence was the first thought, but I'm also wondering whether there are distortions of religions, antipathies toward religion in the process of trying to imagine climate change. So I'm going to second a theme that I think has already been raised about the failures of imagination in coming to grips with climate change. In proposing this project, I noted the example of an inconvenient truth in which Al Gore, who has written about climate change and its relationship to his life in Earth in the Balance, and then in the book version of An Inconvenient Truth. And he talks about the transformative experience of his son's accident. And he very clearly and passionately talks about the role of his religious practice in getting him through that experience. So he talks about he and his wife praying in the hospital, refers to the nurses as figurative angels, but it leaves open the possibility that there were angels looking out for his son during that recovery period. When Davis Guggenheim addresses this in his version of An Inconvenient Truth, religion is cut out, and instead we get Gore's relationship with nature, his sort of a quest around the world. And in addition to removing religion from Gore's account of this experience, we get an almost quasi-religious depiction of Gore. We get this kind of almost like a transfiguration of Gore in An Inconvenient Truth. And this was picked up on by climate skeptics, or cynics as I prefer to call them. And so we got an image of Saint Gore that was kind of circulating around on the web, and this tied into a theme in criticism of climate change activism, which is the global warming as religion meme. And this is still out there, still active. These are some headlines or titles of op-eds from conservative responses to Trump's decision to withdraw the United States from the climate agreement. So we've got green religion, we've got Trump skips the climate church, we have references to a climate god, and we have this notion of Americans as dissenters from enforced orthodoxy. So I want to stress that in addition to the sort of theme of apocalypse that we're sort of dealing with, and its quasi-religious or religious roots, we also have this other version of religion, which is very much a part of the debate on climate change. Now, I wanted to look at the role that religion played in Cli-Fi films, and this builds on an earlier project I had in which I just wanted to do a survey of Cli-Fi films, and I discovered that there had been something on the order of 55 films produced over the last 30 years that address climate change in some way. This is a table from the article I produced about this, and it shows the chronology of these films, and it breaks them down by impact. In that same article, I then also resorted the films by the genres that were employed in talking about climate change, and you can see in the middle column there that disaster films are by far the biggest, and then there are apocalyptic films and dystopic films. And so this is an opportunity to clarify my definitions here. By disaster film, I mean a film in which a natural disaster occurs, it ends, and we're back to the world as it was. So the world has not been transformed. In an apocalyptic film, typically a disaster or some event occurs that shifts the world into a new mode. So in The Day After Tomorrow, for example, I have a series of superstorms which shifts the world into an ice age. A dystopic film starts and ends in the altered world. So a film like The Colony, which I'll show you in a moment, begins in the ice age. In a subsequent article that I wrote for Yale Climate Connections, I happened to discover that the date at which I had cut off my own investigation of Cli-Fi films actually was a kind of a turning point or a marking point in the production of Cli-Fi films. I am not sure why, but in 2016, there were, to the best of my knowledge, no Cli-Fi films produced. There appear to be some coming out in 2017. So unlike what's happening with Cli-Fi novels, which the production of these has just proceeded apace, there was this lull in Cli-Fi films, which may indicate the sense that studios are not sure about the public interest in this, or at least not sure enough to sort of float a project. Okay. I'm going to look at a series of apocalyptic films in very broad terms and a series of dystopic films. This one is from 1993, a made-for-TV movie. It depicts a broad spectrum of climate impacts and suggests that, and it's actually set in 2017, that we have finally hit a point where we are experiencing major and dramatic effects of climate change and can't go back. There were a series of films that dealt with ice ages as a possible and kind of paradoxical impact of climate change. This is the impact of The Day After Tomorrow. From what I know of how Hollywood operates, if you have one very successful film, you will have a whole series of imitations. And these were 3 other imitations that followed The Day After Tomorrow. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have seen Ice or Ice 220? Okay, this was a made-for-TV movie in Britain, and it's Ice Age in Britain. One of the ways of sort of varying the theme of the Ice Age was just to pick a new country and sort of put an Ice Age there. So absolute zero is Miami. 100 degrees below zero is Paris, and Ice 2020 is you get Ice Age London. Then there were 2 films that looked at the thawing of the Arctic and what might be released by that. And then finally, the film Noah was interpreted by some as a kind of environmental / climate change film, obviously dealing with the flood. Dystopic films, for some reason I couldn't get the program to sort of lay them out. in different themes. We've got 3 films that deal with rising sea levels as a result of the melting Arctic, Waterworld, AI, and Lost City Raiders. We have 3 films which look at Arctic/nuclear winter, Road, Colony, Snowpiercer, and 2 Last Survivors and Mad Max that deal with desert or drought. And what I wanted to do in looking at these and going back and reviewing these films was, so how is religion incorporated, if at all? And the reason to pose this question is, at least within the United States, most Americans say they are still believe in God, still have a religious faith. So any American film that deals with the topic, to be realistic in presenting society, should incorporate a religious practice. And in times of stress, even people who have given up their religious practice might find themselves resorting to it. So it would be kind of realistic that in a time of great stress, people would explore their religious roots. But what I found in the first set of films was no acknowledgement of this whatsoever. You can go through the entire film, and people who are dealing with impending danger, sudden crises, pain, suffering, and personal sacrifice, up to giving their lives to protect the lives of others. Religion does not enter into this at all. There are another set of films that offer nominal acknowledgements of religion. You might see a chapel, you might see a ruined church, you might see a religious statuary, you might hear an "oh my God." You might have a kind of an instance of prayer, but there's no consistent practice. The one possible classification problem here might be The Road, where there is talk about God, but I sort of interpreted that as more along the lines of fate. There's certainly no standard practice or no consistent practice. There's a scene in the movie in which they discover someone's bomb shelter, and it's been stored with food, so they actually can eat a full meal for the first time in weeks, months. And the son asks, should we give thanks? And then he sort of puts his hand together, but asks whether he's doing it right, which suggests they haven't been doing this. But I recognize that someone else might classify this differently. And then the last group of films, we have religion transformed. And this can mean either a devolution of religion, it can mean we get opposing religious viewpoints, or it can be a kind of a new kind of syncretization. So in The Last Winter, we have the release of animal spirits by the melting of the tundra. In Noah, you've got a kind of elemental form of the Judeo-Christian tradition. The fallen angels are depicted as kind of stone giants, monsters that help Noah construct the ark. But then in something like Snowpiercer, Mad Max, and Waterworld, you get kind of warrior/machine/death cults that are then opposed by kind of earth religions, which are often identified or associated with the women. Lost City Raiders is a kind of an outlier. It's a strange combination of Waterworld, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I would also add the Da Vinci Code. We have a kind of a cult connection between the Roman Catholic Church and some sort of alien icon that is going to help civilization reduce sea levels. So we have these very strange depictions of religion when it's depicted. Now, in the course of undertaking this project, I was also working on another paper I'm actually delivering in Leicester tomorrow that looked at the contemporary politics surrounding the withdrawal from the Paris Accord. And in researching that, I came across a quote which very explicitly incorporated religion into the experience. And Here we see someone who's in a crisis, cries out, initially with fear, but in the repetitions, and you can hear it in her voice as she's repeating this, she's kind of calming herself down, bringing herself under control as she's requesting God's help. The context for this is someone who was riding in the car with Ammon Bundy and Lavoy Finnegate. These were two people who were engaged in the takeover of the Oregon Wildlife Refuge. And so you have a group of people who see themselves as embroiled in a conflict with the larger culture. So even though many would see the United States as a Christian culture, they saw their Christianity as separate from that. And that led me to rethink the idea of apocalypse itself and the role it originally played. And so I'm going to suggest, as a sort of provocative term, that we can use our contemporary political experience to question the notion of apocalypse. And so I've coined the term Crexit, which is a Christian exit. And by that, I want to point out that apocalypse usually also includes a social, political, or conflict or struggle, and that the people who are theorizing the end are also trying to bring an end to one's subjugation, to their subjugation by an unworthy or unjust appointment. Others, including those who may have abandoned the faith that one holds. So there's a kind of revenge fantasy that's involved in an apocalypse. And this brought me back to one of the films where we have a character who is struggling with his own resentments against authority, against others' attempt to force him to change the way he lives his life. And the other film that I wanted to compare it with is a very recent one, 2015, called The Kingsman. And it takes a completely different stance toward resentment. It just kind of fans the resentment. In The Fire Next Time, we have a character who goes through a series of engagements with alternative visions of the world, and particularly of environmentalism. He deals with boutique environmentalists, with a Gaia commune, with a planned community, with Earth Firsters. But then the engagement that really transforms his character from an independent person who's stubbornly resisting all efforts to force him to change the way he lives his life is an engagement with an Amish farmer. The simplicity of that enables him to accept and celebrate interdependence and connection. So I saw that as a positive depiction of how one could move forward. By contrast, has anyone seen Kingsman? Okay. This is a fiendishly clever way of playing off of stoking feelings of resentment. The central character here is a young man who started life in the middle class, but due to the death of his father, sort of falls into a working class situation. He's angry about snobbish elites. He's also angry at the dysfunction of his own family. But the lead villain in this story is a black, and I would say he's coded as gay, internet entrepreneur who has come up with a scheme to reduce the human population by inciting irrational, violent anger through telephone cards. If you lived through the election in 2008, you may have encountered videos about the Obama card. So there's a kind of racial code. My vocabulary is escaping me here. Dog whistles. So we've got resentment against a dysfunctional family. We got class resentment. We've got resentment against outsiders, possibly gender resentments, and then finally the elites who are running the Secret Service are actually conspiring with the villain. So we've got the betrayal of elites. The film works in a way that allows you to sort of dismiss and judge these people, but then also take pleasure in the violence that's done to them. So it's kind of a strange, allowing you to experience resentment, but exonerate yourself for it. And the perhaps most conspicuous moment of that is when the villain goes to a church in Kentucky, which is described as a hate church, to test out his weapon. And we see the slaughter of every person in that church in a scene that is driven by a rock score. And then we are exonerated for our pleasure in that by the way the villain sort of kills the last remaining survivor of that. From this perhaps strange survey of Cli-Fi films, I wanted to draw these conclusions. First, I want to stress that climate change is already entangled with religion in ways that make effective action more rather than less difficult. Second, I want to stress that fictional depictions of climate change distort our understanding of religion as much as they do of climate change. Some of this might be explained by the way we market films, but I don't think all of it can be. In coining this term Crexit, I want to suggest that the genres of apocalypse and dystopia are themselves problematic in trying to use them to address climate change. That apocalypse carries with it class, cultural, political, or social antagonisms. By bringing in the notion of Crexit, reminding ourselves that there are these contemporary social political arguments that are being addressed or engaged when we're dealing with notions of the future apocalypse, I think we can remind ourselves of those limits. And then last, and I didn't fill in the blank here, 4 of these films actually depict a culling of the human population in order to address climate change. So if you're a conservative and you're already skeptical about climate change, and you look at these films, you're seeing at least 2 things right off the top. One is religion is either ignored or it's very negatively portrayed. And second, you are being asked to contemplate the culling of human population as a solution to the problem. So in addition to the fantastical plot lines that are sometimes involved in depicting climate change, you've got some noxic ideas. So as a way of communicating climate change, I think Cli-Fi films are at best problematic.
Thank you, Michael. Michael? Oh, there you go.
Thank you. I wondered whether you'd looked at any of the fiction, like the Left Behind series.
I have,
the extent to which, whether any of these issues come up in that kind of genre.
No, there actually is a kind of a film industry that's devoted to Christian disaster films. And in a broad sense, I would put Left Behind in that category. But I have not seen a Christian film that addresses climate change. I'm not sure the reasoning behind that. It could be that that's a storyline that's difficult to include into a Christian context, whereas a disaster movie, one can either appeal to God, either to stave off the disaster or to give one the strength to live through it. There's an industry out there that does sort of incorporate Christianity into disaster, but I've not seen them address climate change.
I'm kind of interested because I know a lot of the evangelicals are conflicted about climate change.
Mm-hmm.
The older ones want to spend all their time, arguing against abortion, and the younger ones are saying, well, things like climate change are biblical, and we should be looking at these. I'd be very interesting, I mean, whether it's in books or whatever, to see whether there's any effect comes by.
At this stage, I'm not aware of a conservative evangelical engagement with climate change. I may be wrong. It may just be off my radar, but I've not seen it. I will say there are some interesting stories that one could use from the Bible to sort of address the issue. They're not typically the ones that are brought up. The story of Joseph, for example, you could sort of say that his interpretation of the dream is a kind of an example of climate modeling. And as a response to that, they sort of work out a way of solving the food problem during the 7 years of famine.
Yeah, just on that last point, I think it's called creation care, the movement of evangelicals who are concerned about climate. It is quite significant now.
But yeah, I would say that's separate than the conservative evangelicals.
Oh, right, okay, fine.
Yeah.
Michael, thank you. I agree with your fundamental thesis. It seems to me that the extent to which film has done a good job to date in addressing climate and waking us up to it is very limited. And I think the extent to which religion has been involved with that is even more limited. And I think that's regrettable, and I think it has to change. But can I just mention two exceptions, which I think are quite important? One you touched on, which is the road. And I think that I would urge you to look more closely at the road. I think that it is pretty clear when one does so that there is an idea running through it which emerges more and more as the film goes on, although I admit it's even more explicit in the book, of it's sort of God is dead and we're living with godlessness, but that can't last, and we have to find a new spirituality if we're going to survive as a species at all. And that is what the boy is attempting to develop, incredibly sort of almost out of nothing, because he has virtually nothing to go on. And I think that's actually really quite an exciting, almost awe-inspiring thought. The other exception you might not accept, but I think it is actually massively important, which is the biggest budget film, not biggest budget, the biggest box office success of all time, namely Avatar. Avatar is absolutely centrally concerned with religion, with Earth religion, roughly. And admittedly, it's not explicitly concerned with climate, but 3 points about that. Firstly, it is explicitly concerned with extreme extractivism. Secondly, I've argued in print that it can be read metaphorically as about climate, partly through its concern with the composition of the atmosphere. And thirdly, if you look at audience reception, it's very clear that many people take it that way, whether it was intended to or not, that many people come out of Avatar roughly and literally say things like, oh, we have to take better care of the planet, we must stop destroying the atmosphere, through etc., etc. So I think Avatar is actually, there's as much hope attached to Avatar and its incredible, humongous success, it seems to me, as there is and should be despair attached to all the other films that you mentioned.
I would agree with your assessment of Avatar. You know, I think it delivers a very positive message and does so in a provocative and engaging fashion. I have a fairly strict definition of what I would consider a cli-fi film, and that didn't fit. I've not read the book, The Road, so it may go in the direction you're suggesting. I did note in watching it the second time in preparation for this that there's a conflict between the father and the son, or at least a contrast between the father and the son, where the son has a immediate openness, generosity toward others that the father is trying to sort of train out of him. And that's an interesting take on the notion of religion, of original sin, and sort of how one constructs it in that context. And there were several films here in which there's a kind of assumption that there's a underlying openness toward others that can be drawn on in a time of disaster. But it is interesting that almost all of the films I looked at omit any discussion of religion in the process of wrestling with our fellow feeling. There was another point I was going to make, and I've slipped it. Other questions?
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. It's extremely stimulating. I just wondered, though, with the cli-fi genre, when you say that religion is, on the whole, either absent or presented in an essentially negative way, how unusual is that if you were to compare it just with films in general emerging from America in the last sort of 20 years? Is this really exceptional? I mean, religion is generally not present or handled as if it's, on the whole, rather a negative thing in most mainstream films.
I think that's fair. I think certainly in action genres, thrillers, there's a whole series of genres in which that's true. And possibly that's because you're thinking about global market, you want the film to go from the US to China. And therefore, an explicit Judeo-Christian engagement with religion is possibly an obstacle. On the other hand, as I was on the flight over, I watched a film called Hidden Figures, which is about the African-American women who worked in NASA in the early years of the space program, and their religious life is clearly brought into the film. So it's almost as if religion is, from the standpoint of the film industry, an historical artifact. One engages with it either anthropologically or historically, but it isn't a present concern. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I just add that the film The Colony, when I saw that, and I'm afraid I got rather bored and switched off about halfway through, but in the beginning...
There's that little chapel scene.
Yeah, they have a chapel scene, and actually at the time it struck me, I thought, this is really weird, because I've just watched about a dozen apocalyptic films and nobody ever has that kind of image. So I really appreciate your presentation. Thank you very much.
Now, I was watching 55 climate films over the course of a couple of years was an interesting undertaking. One finds certain patterns repeated over and over and over and over again.
Time for one more question. Anybody? Sally.
It was just building on that cultural thing, because you have lots of Chinese or Bollywood or European or Iranian films that do deal sort of with religion in a social context, maybe not overtly, but continually. So it just brings in sort of hints of nationalism, and the same with Kingsman and the sort of little resentments filter into a nationalistic viewpoint, which is probably... not helpful to climate change discussions.
I would agree. And I don't know whether we will have time to address it in any way in the context of this forum, but climate skepticism is pretty much an Anglo-American phenomenon. And I've not yet seen anyone offer a good explanation for why it has taken root so firmly in the United States and Great Britain and Australia, and not in France and Germany and Japan or Korea. So there's some sort of cultural / national issue here that is at this stage undiagnosed from my standpoint.
It's also in Russia.
Huh?
Russia.
Okay.
Sorry, it kind of,
that's a blind
for
spot
me,
in mine.
filters into the militarization and a really patriarchal mindset. And that's a very vague, I haven't followed through on that, but I'm sure it links to the militarization as well.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. We're running about 15 minutes behind schedule, but because Benjamin's not with us, we're going to stick 15 minutes behind schedule. So take an hour for lunch, and we'll meet back here in 1:15, please. Thank you.